Chapter 4. Pursuit. The hysterical women's cries and the shrilling of the militia whistles had died down. 2 ambulances had driven away, one with the headless body and the severed head to the morgue, the other with the beautiful conductor wounded by the flying glass. Janitors in white aprons removed the broken glass and scattered sand over the pools of blood. And Ivan Nikolaevich, who had dropped onto a bench before he reached the turnstile, stayed on it motionless. He had tried repeatedly to get up, but his feet refused to obey him. Holmes was stricken by something akin to paralysis. The poet had rushed toward the turnstile at the first scream and saw the bouncing head on the pavement. Crazed with horror, he dropped onto a bench and bit his own hand till it bled. He naturally forgot the insane German and tried to grasp one thing only. How could it be that he had just a moment earlier spoke to Berlioz, and now his head? Frantic people ran down the avenue past the poet, exclaiming something, but Ivan Nikolaevich did not understand what they said. Suddenly 2 women collided near him, and one of them, sharp-nosed and disheveled, shouted to the other right over the poet's ears, "Annushka, our Annushka from Sadovaya, it's her work. She bought some sunflower oil at the store and broke the bottle on the turnstile. She got it all over her skirt and swore, and that poor man, he slipped on it and right down on the rails." Of all the words the woman shouted, only one word stuck in the deranged brain of Ivan Nikolaevich. Annushka, Annushka, Annushka. The poet muttered, looking around him anxiously. But wait. The word Annushka connected itself to the words sunflower oil, and then for some reason to Pontius Pilate. The poet rejected Pilate and began to weave a chain beginning with Annushka. The chain was linked very fast and immediately led to the crazy professor. Wait, but he said that the meeting would not be held because Annushka had spilled the oil, and now, if you please, it won't be held. But that isn't all. He said to Berlioz directly that a woman would cut off his head. Yes, and the conductor was a woman. But what can it mean? There was not a grain of doubt that the mysterious consultant had exact foreknowledge of the entire picture of the editor's horrible death. And 2 thoughts pierced the poet's mind. The first was, he's not a madman, that's nonsense. And the second, could he have planned it all himself? But how, if you allow me to ask? Oh no, we must find out. Making a great effort, Ivan Nikolaevich rose from the bench and rushed back to where he had spoken to the professor. And fortunately, he found that the latter had not yet gone. The street lights were already on along Bronne, and a golden moon shone over the Patriarch's ponds. And in the light of the moon, always deceptive, it seemed to Ivan Nikolaevich that the man stood, holding under his arm not a cane, but a sword. The importunate ex-choirmaster sat where Ivan Nikolaevich himself had sat a little while before. Now the choirmaster saddled his nose with an obviously unnecessary pair of pince-nez, in which one lens was entirely absent and the other cracked. This made the checkered citizen even more repulsive than when he had directed Berlioz to the rails. With a chill in his heart, Ivan approached the professor, and glancing into his face, he found that it did not bear and had indeed never borne any marks of madness. "Confess to me, who are you?" Ivan asked in a hollow voice. The foreigner scowled, looked up as though he was seeing the poet for the first time, and answered in a hostile tone, "No understand, no speak Russian." "The gentleman does not understand." The choirmaster intruded into the conversation from his bench, although no one had asked him to interpret the foreigner's words. "Stop pretending," Ivan said threateningly, and felt a chill at the pit of his stomach. "You have just been speaking excellent Russian. You are no German and no professor. You are a murderer and a spy. Your documents!" Ivan cried in a rage. The mysterious professor squeamishly twisted his crooked mouth and shrugged his shoulders. "Citizen," the vile choirmaster broke in again, "why are you upsetting the tourist? You'll answer for it, remember." And the suspicious professor made a haughty face, turned, and walked away from Ivan. Ivan felt that he was losing his grip. Suffocating, he turned to the choirmaster. "Hey, citizen, help me catch the criminal. You must do it." The choirmaster jumped up with extraordinary animation and shouted, "Which criminal? Where is he? A foreign criminal?" His little eyes shone with glee. "That one? If he is a criminal, the first thing we must do is shout 'Help!' or he will get away. Come on, together now!" And the choirmaster opened his maw. In his confusion, Ivan obeyed the prankster choirmaster and shouted, "Help!" But the choirmaster had tricked him and did not shout anything. The solitary hoarse cry sent up by Ivan brought no desired results. Two young ladies shied away from him, and he heard the word "drunk." "And so you are in with him?" Ivan cried, bursting into fury. "Making a fool of me? Get out of my way!" Ivan rushed right, and the choirmaster did the same. Ivan rushed left, and the scoundrel followed. "Getting into my way on purpose?" Ivan cried, choking with rage. "I'll turn you over to militia, too!" Ivan tried to catch the rogue by the sleeve, but missed and caught exactly nothing. The choirmaster seemed to have vanished into thin air. Ivan gasped, looked up, and saw the hateful stranger in the distance. He was already at the exit to Patriarch's Lane, and he was not alone. The more than dubious choirmaster had already managed to join him. But this was not all. There was a third member of this company who had appeared from heaven knows where, a tomcat, huge as a hog, black as pitch or a crow, and with a huge mustache for all the world like a rakish cavalryman's. The trio marched off into Patriarch's Lane, the tomcat walking on his hind legs. Ivan hurried after the malefactors, but he saw at once that it would be difficult to catch up with them. The trio dashed through the lane in an instant and was emerging on Spiridonovka. No matter how much Ivan increased his pace, the distance between him and those he pursued never diminished. Before he knew it, he was out of the quiet Spiridonovka and at the Nikitsky gate, and here the milling crowds made his position still more hopeless. Besides, the criminal band resorted to the favorite strategy of thieves and scattered. The choirmaster nimbly whirled himself into a bus, speeding toward Arbat Square, and disappeared. Having lost one of the gang, Ivan concentrated his attention on the tomcat and saw how the strange Tom walked over to the boarding step of an A streetcar, waiting at the stop, brazenly elbowed aside a woman who squealed as she saw him, grasped the handrails, and even attempted to give the conductor a coin through the window, which was open because of the heat. The Tom's behavior struck Ivan with such amazement that he stopped transfixed near the grocery store on the corner. And now he was struck again, even more forcibly, by the behavior of the woman conductor. As soon as she saw the Tom trying to climb into the streetcar, she screamed, trembling with rage, "No cats allowed here! Nobody with cats allowed! Scram! Get off, or I'll call the militia!" Neither the conductor nor the passengers were as astounded by the situation itself. A cat climbing into a streetcar, which would not have been half so bad as by his wish to pay his fare. The Tom, it turned out, was not only a solvent, but also a disciplined beast. At the conductor's first cry, he ceased his advance, got down from the step, and sat down at the curb, rubbing his whiskers with the coin. But as soon as the conductor pulled the cord and the cars started, the Tom proceeded to do what anyone else would who had been expelled from a streetcar but must nevertheless get to his destination. Allowing all three cars to go by, the Tom jumped up onto the rear of the last one, sank his claws into a rubber tube projecting from the wall, and rode away, thus saving himself the fare. Preoccupied with the wretched Tom, Ivan had nearly lost the principal offender, the professor. Luckily, he had not yet managed to escape. Ivan caught sight of the grey beret in the thick of the crowd at the opening into Bolshaya Nikitskaya or Herzen Street. In a twinkling of an eye, Ivan was there. But his object eluded him. The poet tried to walk faster. He even broke into a trot, shoving the other pedestrians, but he never got nearer the professor, even by an inch. Disturbed as he was, Ivan was nevertheless astonished by the unnatural speed of the chase. 20 seconds had not elapsed when, after passing the Nikitsky gate, Ivan Nikolaevich was already dazzled by the lights of Arbat Square. Another few seconds and he was in some dark alley with broken sidewalks, where he fell and hurt his knee. Another brightly lit thoroughfare, Kropotkin Street, then a lane, then Ostozhenka, and yet another lane, dreary, filthy, and poorly lit. And it was here that Ivan Nikolaevich finally lost the man he was pursuing so desperately. The professor disappeared. Ivan Nikolaevich was disconcerted, but not for long, because he suddenly knew that the professor must be in number 13 and in no other apartment About 47. Bursting into the entrance, Ivan Nikolaevich flew up to the second floor, immediately found this apartment, and rang impatiently. He did not have to wait long. The door was opened by a little girl of about 5, who withdrew somewhere at once without asking the guest any questions. In a huge, extremely ill-kept foyer, feebly lit by a tiny carbon lamp under the high, dirty ceiling, there stood an enormous iron-covered chest. On the wall hung a bicycle without tires, and on a shelf over the clothes rack lay a winter hat, its long ear flaps hanging down. Behind one of the doors, a resonant man's voice angrily declaimed something in verse over a radio set. Ivan Nikolaevich, not in the least confused by the unfamiliar surroundings, walked straight into the hallway, thinking to himself. He naturally hid in the bathroom. The hallway was dark. Bumping into the wall a few times, Ivan finally discerned a faint streak of light under a door, felt for the handle and pulled it. The hook flew off, and Ivan found himself precisely in the bathroom, thinking that he was in luck. However, his luck was not quite what it should have been. A wave of moist heat came at Ivan, and in the light of the coals glowing in the boiler, he saw large troughs hanging on the wall and the bathtub full of ugly black spots left by the chipped enamel, and in the bathtub stood a naked woman, all covered with soap and with a wash rag in her hands. She squinted nearsightedly at the intruder, and evidently mistaking him for someone else in the infernal light, said quietly and gaily, "Kiryushka, stop your games. Have you lost your mind? Fyodor Ivanovich will be here in a minute. Get out right away." And she swung her wash rag at Ivan. The misunderstanding was obvious, and of course it was all the fault of Ivan Nikolaevich. But he refused to admit it and cried out reproachfully, "Ah, you slut!" and immediately found himself in the kitchen. The kitchen was empty. About a dozen unlit Primus stoves stood in the oven in the dusk. A single moonbeam, peeping in through the dusty window that had not been washed for years, dimly lit up the corner where a forgotten icon hung in dust and cobwebs. Behind its case, Ivan could see the tips of 2 wedding candles. Under the large icon, there was pinned a little one made of paper. Nobody knows what idea possessed Ivan at this point, but before running out to the back stairs, he appropriated one of the candles and the paper icon. With these objects, he left the strange apartment, muttering something embarrassed by his recent experience in the bathroom, involuntarily trying to guess the identity of that brazen Kiryushka, and wondering whether he was the owner of the disgusting hat with the ear flaps. In a dismal, empty alley, the poet glanced around, looking for the fugitive, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then Ivan said to himself, "But of course, he is at the Moskva River. Onward!" One might perhaps ask Ivan Nikolaevich why he assumed that the professor would be precisely near Moskva River and not anywhere else. But the trouble is that there was no one to ask this. The foul alley was totally deserted. After a short time, Ivan Nikolaevich could be seen on the granite steps of the amphitheater by the Moskva River. Removing his clothes, Ivan left them in the care of a sympathetic bearded man who was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette as he sat near a torn white Tolstoy blouse and a pair of unlaced worn shoes. Waving his arms to cool off, Ivan plunged into the water like a swallow. The water was so cold that it stopped his breath, and for a moment the thought flashed through his mind that he might not be able to surface. However, he succeeded in coming up, and blowing and snorting, his eyes bulging with terror, Ivan Nikolaevich began to swim in the black water that reeked of oil between the broken zigzags of lights along the banks. When the wet Ivan came skipping up the stairs where his clothing had been left under the protection of the bearded man, he found it that not only the former, but the latter, had been abducted. On the spot where there had been a pile of clothes, there were now only the striped pants, the torn Tolstoy blouse, the candle, the icon, and a box of matches. Shaking his fist at someone in the distance with impotent fury, Ivan dressed himself in the remaining rags. At this point, he was gripped by 2 anxieties. First, that the Massolit identification, with which he never parted, was gone. And second, would he be able to cross Moscow unmolested in this outfit? After all, in underpants. True, whose business was it? And yet there was a possibility that he might be halted and detained. Ivan pulled the buttons off the underpants where they fastened at the ankle, hoping that in this form they might be taken for summer slacks, Then he picked up the little icon, the candle, and the matches, and started out saying to himself, "To Gribayev, no question that he is there." The city was already busy with its evening life. Clanking their chains, trucks flew clouds of dust, and on their platforms, on sacks, men lay stretched out with their stomachs up. All windows were open. In each window there was a lamp under an orange shade, and from all windows, all doors, all gateways, roofs, and attics, cellars, and courtyards came the hoarse blasts of the Polonaise from the opera Eugene Onegin. The apprehension of Ivan Nikolaevich were fully realized. Passers-by looked at him and turned to stare. Consequently, he resolved to leave the thoroughfares and make his way through back alleys, where people were not so importunate and were less likely to harass a barefoot man and worry him with questions about underpants that stubbornly refused to look like trousers. Ivan plunged into the mysterious network of Arbat alleys and began to slink along walls, anxiously squinting, glancing over his shoulder, sometimes hiding in gateways and avoiding crossing lit by street lights and the luxurious entrances of consular mansions. And all along his difficult journey, he was inexpressibly tormented for some reason by the ubiquitous orchestra accompanying a heavy basso who sang of his love for Tatiana.